Good evening, and welcome to the UCLA Department of History's Alden-Berg Lecture. I'm Kevin Tarasiano, Chair of the History Department, and I want to thank you for joining us today for an important and stimulating discussion that explores a more positive alternative history of the American West. Many of you here today know that the Alden-Berg Lecture is named for two distinguished alumni and friends of the History Department, Barbara Berg and the late Jerry Alden, who both received their PhDs in history. This lecture series allows us to invite notable academics and scholars to address important issues of the past and the present. And I am very pleased and thrilled to introduce today's speaker, our very own Steve Aron, Professor Emeritus of the UCLA Department of History, former chair of that great department, and currently the Calvin and Marilyn Gross Director, President, and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West. Steve assumed leadership of the Autry Museum in July 2021 after a 3-decade career as a professor of history, first at Princeton University, and then for a quarter-century at UCLA. A specialist in the history of frontiers, borderlands, and the American West, he holds degrees from Amherst College, his BA, and the University of California, Berkeley, his MA and PhD. He's the author of many books, including How the West Was Lost, I love that title, The Transformation of Kentucky from Daniel Boone to Henry Clay in 1996, American Confluence, The Missouri Frontier from Borderland to Border State, 2006, and The American West, A Very Short Introduction, 2015. Steve's most recent book, Peace and Friendship, An Alternative History of the American West, was published in 2022 by Oxford University Press. His scholarship, which also includes scores of articles and book chapters, has earned several prizes, been recognized by his election to the Society of American Historians, and as president of the Western History Association, and by his appointment to the Peter and Margaret D'Angelo Chair in the Humanities at St. John's University. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Steve, who will be up here in a minute. At the start of this evening's program, however, we would like to say a few words in remembrance of Jerry Alden. First, I would like to thank sincerely Barbara Berg for joining us here tonight. Thank you, Barbara. We're now going to share a video message from David Myers, my good friend David, professor and former chair of the department, followed by Steve, who will conclude our in memoriam remarks and begin his talk. Thank you all very much for leading us in our remembrance of Jerry Alden. Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Myers, professor of Jewish history and former chair of the UCLA History Department. In our social media crazed world of TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, the past is often measured in seconds and minutes. It's a challenge to recall that we're products of a much longer past, measured in years, centuries, and millennia. That's the domain of the historian, who fights against the gravitational pull of the present to reconstruct the past, and in doing so, opens up exciting and troubling new worlds of human experience. We at the UCLA History Department are committed to this work, and we've been supported for decades by a cadre of friends who appreciate the import of the study of the past. First among equals of these friends are Barbara Berg and Jerry Alden. You'll hear from Barbara in a minute, but I did want to say a word about Jerry, actually 2 words. First, Jerry was not just a lover of history, She was a scholar of history. Like Barbara, she went back to UCLA as an adult, received a BA with honors, then an MA, and after that proceeded to pursue a PhD in French history, completing a dissertation on the French leftist collaborator Jean Loucher. What animated Jerry was not the quest for professional advancement, but rather the passion to know the past with as much texture and granularity as possible. The second piece about Jerry that I'd like to convey is that she, along with Barbara, was the convener of the wonderful, decades-long Friend of History salons. In the unforgettable ambiance of Jerry and Hal's home, many of us in the UCLA History Department would be invited to discuss our research, from ancient Rome to the contemporary United States. It was a wonderfully intimate and vibrant intellectual setting, presided over by Jerry with her customary grace, wit, and wisdom. No one who ever set foot in Jerry's salon can ever forget it. We miss that intimate setting and Jerry Alden's elegant way, but we are delighted to recall her unforgettable spirit tonight, as we do each time when we convene for the Alden-Berg lecture.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be back at UCLA. I could say this was a sign of what's happened since I left.
Thank you.
And I guess I really have to sort of restrain myself from my usual lecturing mode, which sort of involves a lot of movement, both because I would then get in front of the screen here and I would likely fall and tumble to my premature demise. I'm really grateful, though, for the invitation to deliver this year's Alden-Berg lecture. It allows me the opportunity to speak about the book I published last year that Kevin mentioned in his generous introduction, Peace and Friendship, An Alternative History of the American West. The book focuses on places and times in which individuals and people on the American frontier overcame past enmities and charted a fractured, tenuous, and ultimately toppled path towards amity. That these trails proved historical cul-de-sacs does not, in my view, diminish their importance then or now. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit then about this legacy of opened, if broken, concord and the lessons we might take from what I call an alternative history of the American West. And then I'll explain what I mean by the rest of the title of this lecture in the unexpurgated version and how it ties to my journey at UCLA and to the destination it has taken me at the Autry Museum. But more than just a chance to talk about a recent book, the invitation to give this lecture allows me to acknowledge the many debts I owe to UCLA, accumulated over the 25 years that I was privileged to spend here as a member of the faculty of the History Department. Peace and Friendship is a book very much shaped by that quarter century, by the colleagues that I was privileged to have here, by the students that I was fortunate to teach here, and by the larger community of history Bruins that I got to know here. Influenced by UCLA, Peace and Friendship now inspires the work that I do and the vision I have for the Autry Museum, and more broadly, for a future-facing, public-embracing history that can save our asses. Let me start those debts. Let me start the acknowledgement of debts with a few words echoing what David Myers said about the two women whose names adorn this lecture. The Alden-Berg lecture, as David pointed out, honors two longtime friends of the UCLA History Department. Jerry Alden, and I'm very sorry, Barbara, we searched, I had Ann Major scour the web for a photo of you, and somehow you have managed to stay off the internet. In any case, there should be a picture of the two of them because they were partners, not in crime, but in time. As David pointed out, they both came back as non-traditional students, I believe is the phrase we might use, to complete their doctorates at UCLA, and they also founded the UCLA Friends of History group. As the directors of that group for many years, the Friends of Alden-Berg transformed the UCLA History Department at a time when the department had no, or really essentially no, external sources of funding. The Friends of History provided vital support for graduate students. And from those seeds sprang the cultivation that has resulted in the establishment and endowment of dozens of chairs and scores of graduate fellowships over the last quarter century. To credit the Friends of History merely for the funds they raised and the fundraising they instigated, however, misses the group's broader significance. In opening their homes for stimulating salons, Jerry Alden and Barbara Berg brought our faculty out of the classrooms and into, literally, their living rooms. I was privileged to present at one of their salons shortly after I arrived at UCLA, and it was there, in that setting, that I initially glimpsed the possibilities that lay beyond the mainstreams of academic history. That evening, I think I took my first baby steps towards the rockier rewards of a public embracing history that seeks to meet people where they are and to make history matter more to more people. As long as I'm acknowledging debts and talking about the transformations of the UCLA History Department, I should also say a word, and it really doesn't, the lighting here sort of destroys this image of Gary Nash, who also passed away not that long ago. Gary was, of course, in his first act, an eminent scholar of early America. But it was his second act, largely after his retirement, that he became, certainly started as founder of the National Center for History in the Schools, that Gary connected the department to K-12 students and teachers and blazed a trail towards a more engaged and impactful history. I don't have time to offer a full history of public history at UCLA, but if Jerry Alden and Barbara Berg and Gary Nash feature in the first stages of mine and the department's transformations, Meyer and Renee Luskin, who couldn't be here tonight because Meyer, at age 97, had to go run a board meeting in Chicago. That Meyer and Renee Luskin figure in the department's later transformations, really during my final turn here at UCLA. As chair of the department, I worked closely with Meyer Luskin and David Myers to establish and launch the Luskin Center for History and Policy. As Meyer Luskin explained in his 2014 history commencement address, a knowledge of history had saved his assets. He gave the cleaner version. And from that recognition was born the Luskin Center for History and Policy, whose mission is to bring historical knowledge, research, perspective, and analysis to bear on key contemporary ideas and policy deliberations. In my view, the center, along with the department's public history initiative now, are fitting culminations to what began in the living rooms of Barbara Berg and Jerry Alden. And it's obviously from Meyer's commencement address that I have stolen my title for the lecture, too. Which brings me back then, again, to thank Jerry and Barbara again for all of that. And back to, actually, it's all fallen apart after I left. Which brings me back to peace and friendship and to the meanings and endings of what I call an alternative history of the American West. The alternative history of the American West that I put forward in the new book, in many respects, is a counterpoint to what I would argue is the distilled mainstream history of the American West that I that I distilled, as I said, in The American West: A Very Short Introduction, my previous book. That book, this one, is part of a series that Oxford University Press, there must be several hundred titles in that series. And actually, it's one that several members of the history department at UCLA have contributed to. The aforementioned David Myers did the Jewish history one. Eric Avila more recently did America, the American Cultural History volume, for all I know. And Vern, I'm looking at you now, because you know who's written what in our department more than anyone else. But I'm assuming that those are the ones. But in any case, the thrust of the series is really to distill down a subject into 35,000 words. And they are really sticklers about that 35,000 word limit. I have to say, my volume in its first draft came in at 70,000 words. Trained as an academic historian, brevity was not the strong suit. And I went to the editor and I said, well, I'm writing about a big subject, because my American West is not just the American West as we know it today. It's the American West as it once was. It's all of North America. It's from pre-colonial times to the present. And she said, no. But I sort of went, I said, well, wait a second. Surely there are some leftover words from this volume in the series. But the editor, Nancy Toff, who also was the editor of my Peace and Friendship book, then pointed me to this book in the series. And I suppose, you know, if you can get the meaning of life down in 35,000 words, then surely the American West that can happen too. So I did end up doing the 35,000 word version of the history of the American West. And that is, as I say, my effort to distill what I would think is as the mainstream of academic history into that format. The title of my new book, also from Oxford, as I mentioned, comes from the inscription on peace medals like this one that emissaries of the United States gifted to American Indian leaders, and was a central feature of the diplomacy between Indians and American emissaries, really for a century after the American Revolution. And typically, on one side was a bust of the reigning president, and on the other was this inscription, Peace and Friendship, with the clasped hands between the soldier and the Indian, American Indian figure. Now, neither peace nor friendship readily associate with either the mainstream history or the conventional mythology of the American frontier. What would histories of westward expansion of the United States be without their famous battles and infamous massacres? What would Westerns be without their climactic gunfights? Even as popular culture and scholarship about the American frontier have shifted their views significantly over the last half century, violence has retained its centrality in older and newer Western histories. I guess the chief difference between the two being that in older Western histories, that violence served triumphant purposes. It enabled this triumph of civilization over savagery. It pushed forward the westward expansion of the United States. It is what made America great. By contrast, in newer Western histories and newer Westerns, that sort of triumphalist vision has been largely inverted. But whether in older or newer Western histories, whether celebrations of social progress, political democracy, and economic development, as in older Western histories, or condemnations and the new buzzwords in Western history, certainly not concord, or conquest, or empire, ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, and genocide, whether in older or newer, what holds true is the centrality of violence in both those cases. Indeed, again, to cite, one need look no further than the UCLA History Department for all things, to cite two recent examples of books that I think really capture that new directions in Western history. Ben Madley, sitting right over there, American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, which moves the genocide debate front and center, And Kelly Lytle Hernandez, this is not even her most recent book because she's incredibly prolific. This is her previous one, City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging, which looks through the lens of settler colonialism to explore the history of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. And as I said, though, in common, newer and older histories, whether tales of celebration or devastation, violence is the key continuous element. In the annals of Western American history, then, I think it's safe to say there has not been much peace or friendship. So when I told people that I was going to write a book about peace and friendship on the American frontier, some of them, including some of my colleagues here at UCLA, responded that I must be planning to write another very short book. And hold up the book. That's not a short book, though. Weighing in at 110,000 words, Peace and Friendship is not a short book at all. Dark and bloody as frontiers have been, my book finds sites and situations in which colonialism wore a different face. Where the relations between Indians, settlers, and states deviated for a time from the monolithic logic of genocidal elimination or exclusive occupation. The episodes that I chronicle in the book provide evidence of individuals and people overcoming their differences, of barriers breached and accords reached, of erstwhile enemies finding common ground, of would-be combatants standing down, at least for a time. Traversing American frontiers from the Appalachians to the Pacific, and from the birth of the United States through its first century as a republic, each chapter focuses on a particular locale in which foes faced off. Now, there's nothing obviously alternative about that. But in these cases, violence was contained. The book's contents emphasize, or I should say, the book's contents explore how amicable relations of varying degrees and durations unexpectedly developed at these sites and why those relations collapsed. This is an alternative history that has too often been forgotten or misremembered or turned into what I call wishtory. Before I actually go any further down that path, let me clarify a little bit about the terms I use. When you Google, to my dismay, alternative history, it links you automatically to alternate history. Now, alternate history is the genre in which historical outcomes are altered. It is the sort of what-if sort of version of history. I suppose in its more scholarly veneer, it's sometimes called counterfactual speculation. But either way, well, actually, I'll test this audience here. In the genre of alternate history, what do you think by far the most common sets of titles are? We got a bunch of historians here. Yes, the South winning the Civil War, and number two, World War II, and Hitler wins the Second World War. So now, I guess the key point I would make is that no historian, and we've got a lot of them in this room, no historian reading or watching these alternate histories would mistake them for histories. For my part, I should very clearly clarify, for my part, I am not interested in the book in altering facts, or for that matter, in alternative facts. Although the search engine may conflate alternate history and alternative history, the adjectives, in fact, have distinctive meanings. And for my purposes, alternative meaning outside the mainstream becomes the principal one for my case. In my case, the alternative history that I explore happened. It does not require any what-ifs to set in motion. To be sure, though, the peace and friendship that happened on American frontiers was often unstable. Local arrangements that curtailed violence gave way when balances of power and powerlessness tipped. The interventions and arsenals of empires, states, and nations, though premised on bringing law and order, often disturbed the peace and devastated frontier-crossing friendships. Perhaps above all, the situations featured within my book demonstrate the fragility of conciliations and reconciliations, and show how susceptible this alternative history is to being forgotten or historicized. Still, the episodes lace together to help us better understand when, where, and how people pushed aside their enmities, why those moments occurred yet did not endure, and what we might take away from the legacies of broken concord. The contrast between Legacies of Concord, which is one of the path-breaking books in Western history of the last generation, Patricia Limerick's Legacy of Conquest, a title I'm obviously playing off of here. The contrast between Legacies of Conquest and my Legacies of Concord may suggest that my alternative history is entirely apart from the mainstream of settler colonial history. The one emphasizes people dealing with one another. The other has them stealing from one another. The one features amalgamations. The other, assimilations. The one glimpses better times. The other exposes trails of bitter tears. Now, in fact, though, I would argue that the currents of current scholarship do not divide so cleanly between my alternative history and mainstream history. That is, my alternative history does not exist, as some have suggested, out in the twilight zone, that it's not on a separate plane of existence, a separate parallel universe. That's true of alternate histories, which push into that parallel dimension. Alternative history, at least as I do it, does not, though. It runs alongside the mainstream, revealing a contiguous face of the American frontier. Indeed, it may be useful, I think, to think of, and I almost changed the title of the book in this way, to think of the alternative history as an adjacent history of the American frontier. Not then in worlds apart, histories of concord and conflict should instead be seen as playing out along a spectrum. At different moments on the same timeline, often quite proximate, we find examples of relations moving back and forth from one end of the spectrum to the other, of people trading with former foes in one instance and raiding supposed friends in the next, of convergences coalesced and conversions coerced, of peace between empires, nations, families, and communities brokered and then broken. That shift meant the common ground that was found was often lost. Also, make up my alternative history, accommodations were tenuous. Peaceful coexistences were temporary. Concord could be heralded, but it rarely held. That recognition of the distinguishes my version of alternative history from that subset of alternate history that I refer to as wishtory. That is, the history that people wish for. And I have to say, I took enormous pride in coining that term, wishtory, only to discover, this is why the internet is evil, Barbara, only to discover that in 2009 or 2008, Sears had used it in some Christmas commercial. I have no idea why. But I am not going to give credit to Sears on this. Even though I guess it is fitting that in that Sears commercial, Vanessa Hudgens, I think that's her name, who was a Disney star, was featured in that commercial because Disney is, I think, the chief purveyor of wishtories, of histories we wish for. But, as I said, one of the other things that I think distinguishes wishtories, whether in their older form, the sort of John Wayne Western, or their newer form, and if you can see it, this is Disney's Pocahontas, what distinguishes them is that they also tend to both, A, be untethered from historical fact. They move into that parallel dimension. They move into that alternate realm. They are also tend to feature happily ever after, or presume happily ever after endings. And that's obviously also different from the alternative history that I have written. Indeed, only in more recent Western Only in more recent decades have Western histories written in what classic Westerns of the John Wayne era wrote out. And our histories, too, as I've said, have shifted, with Disney's Pocahontas, I think, serving as a prime example. I think what happened, if those of you who remember the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, which was, in fact, one of the subjects I talked about at the salon at Barbara's and Jerry's home, to bring it all full circle here, it's during that bicentennial, really, that the Lewis and Clark expedition got turned into a feel-good, multicultural, eco-friendly sort of kumbaya fantasy. And that, too, I think, reflects certain historical plans. That's very much at odds, I would say, with the episodes I talk about in Peace and Friendship. Nonetheless, histories do feature in my alternative history, for they are entangled with how the sites featured in the book are remembered or commemorated. And they, too, it seems to me, tell us a great deal about the shifting hopes and dreams, which, as I'll talk about in a moment, is a central piece that the Autry is concerned with. In any case, there I've laid out the table of contents. The episodes featured in the book, I would emphasize, do not unseat the mainstream Western history built on conquest and conflict, nor did they sit apart from it. Conquest and colonialism shaped the histories of the sites featured in Peace and Friendship, as they did the rest of what became the West of the United States. But for a time in these sites, geopolitical and intercultural currents constrained the exclusive occupation of these places by Americans under the uncontested rule of the United States. For varying durations, these alternative relations presented an adjacent face of the American frontier. I don't have time, you'll be pleased to know, I don't have time to summarize the narratives or the key lessons from each chapter, but let me just try to lay out a couple of big takeaways. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago when I was talking about the overall book, one lesson is to upend the oft-repeated claim that violence was vanquished when the forces of law and order, as represented by states, nations, and empires, gained sway over frontiers. That may be true in the long run, but more immediately, the intervention of powerful and well-armed agents of state order undid local arrangements that had curbed excessive violence. At least initially, the entrance of even just the armaments brought forward by empires and nations enabled warfare on a much grander, bloodier scale. Conventional wisdom also reflected in the agendas of recent Truth and Reconciliation commissions holds that to reset relations, an essential first step is to uncover and acknowledge historical wrongs. Only when crimes against humanity are properly recorded and remembered can peoples and nations get past them and move towards rapprochements. I find, though, opposite wisdom, as I often do in Daniel Boone's words, I find opposite wisdom in Daniel Boone's words, which he spoke to his Shawnee Indian captors at the village of Chillicothe in what is now Ohio, when he was taken there as a prisoner and lived as an adopted member of the Shawnees for a few months. Many things happen in war, he said, that were best forgotten in peace. What peace there was in the Ohio Valley during and immediately after the Revolution, and more important, between Shawnees and Americans in that part of the Mississippi Valley where they resettled in the 1790s and in the first decade of the 19th century, rested not on remembering or reckoning for lost lives and lost lands, but on forgetting what had happened between them. Let me see where I am here. Now, before, though, we dismantle our Truth and Reconciliation apparatus, we should remember that peace and friendship required more than people letting bygones be bygones. For recent enemies to live serenely alongside one another required a host of other factors. Oftentimes, it's Group A and B need to gang up against Group C to find common ground. The presence of a sharedness of colonial regimes, the balanced and limited numbers of people. Put these together, and in various situations you have a recipe for people overcoming their past differences and getting along. Take them away, or take any of them away, and intercultural peace and friendship usually faded pretty fast. Time doesn't permit, as all of the lessons that we can glean from the alternative history of opened and broken concord. For that, you have to read the book. I will concede, perhaps to the disappointment of Meyer Luskis, the past is not so one fact or switch off one factor, nor can we wave a one or another true cause. The episodes chronicled and dissected in Peace and Friendship don't yield lessons that can simply be transplanted anywhere, are controversial at times, contradictory, contingent. As I said, alternative history, can we find a record of continuous concord? Even as foes forgot, or at least put aside past enmities, differences were not permanently overcome. The legacy of broken concord in American frontiers from the Ohio Valley to the Pacific Coast and through the first century of the United States underscores instead how effapses frustrate those seeking a sure strings, however. The persistence of hospitable and inclusive cohabitations, even if these did give way. So too, we should remember the imperfect arrangements that forestalled violence for a while. Commemorating compromises that were compromised means accepting that the legacy of concord is not all we might wish for, but better broken concord than no concord, and better to continue to seek out places and periods where peoples once, and not just once upon a time, overcame differences and stood on common ground. Finding common ground is not in the mission statement of the Autry Museum, but inspiring our shared future is, which I guess is another way of saying saving our asses. That ass saving, as the rest of the mission statement reads, depends on our bringing together the stories of all peoples of the American West and connecting the past with the present. I tend to emphasize the bringing together part of the story as it differentiates the Autry from so many other history and culture museums in Los Angeles and around the nation that have more ethnic specific, more singular ethnic focuses. That the Autry, by contrast, aspires to inspire by putting forth a Western history that is inclusive, integrative, present-minded, future-facing, and public-embracing. I recognize that the onus remains on us not just to tell what we're going to do, but to show the value of history. Making history matter more to more people, I've often proclaimed, should be at the top of our to-do list. It's what prompted me, my first foray into a public history and into working with K through 12 teachers and students. And it set my determination to see the Luskin Center for History and Policy established here at UCLA. It's also what led me earlier in my time at UCLA to take on a split appointment at the Autry and to build, or try to build, a bridge between the academy and museum. More recently, it prompted my departure from the wonders and comforts of UCLA to take up the challenges of heading up the Autry Museum, a decision on particularly challenging days that I do wonder about. I'm looking at several of my trustees on this one. When I made the move, I borrowed the mantra with the slight tweak that at the Autry, the imperative is to make the Autry and to make Western history matter more to more people. But my decades of teaching at UCLA taught me that the American West doesn't matter to many people who live around here, at least not as it once did. For my students, the American West has been relegated to an out there and back then, divorced from the here and now and from their own histories, families, and experiences. My response at UCLA. Here, I just give you a smattering of the making history matter and so forth. But my response at UCLA is to emphasize the view from here. Now, the artist of this illustration is in the room. He would probably not want to stand up at this moment, Josh. He's shaking his head. Let me say this. This is obviously a whimsical take on the sort of famous New Yorker cartoon, but looking the other way from Los Angeles, looking east on what we think of as the American West. Now, I want to emphasize here for Josh, he is a much better historian and curator than he is an illustrator. But what I would emphasize here is this is one facet of the view from here, but more than that, the view from here is an attempt to sort of really rethink the way we frame the history of the American West, to put Los Angeles at the center, and to look out in all directions from here, taking in the currents that have shaped this place, whether coming from the south or from across the Pacific, as well as those moving across the continent east to west, and to think about those vectors, but to think about the ways in which the history of Los Angeles in some ways is the history of the West in microcosm, or the history of the West, I would argue, only more so. What happened here doesn't, or didn't and doesn't stay here. That Los Angeles in many ways has exported its view, that in some ways I think the West was largely invented here. And so that gives us a real interesting laboratory from which to look out and reframe the way the history of the West has been thought about, and certainly the way I ever taught it here at UCLA. So who knows where this is going. As Exhibit A, though, and here again, credit to Josh Garrett Davis, consider the Imagined West, a gallery that will open at the Autry Museum on June 25th. Now, I'm going to pause there for a moment to let you all take out your calendars. I don't see any calendars coming out. What? To let you make sure you write that date in your calendars, June 25th. The new gallery, as the title suggests, pluralizes and diversifies our understanding of the history of Western imaginings and of what is a Western. Consider, for example, these two hats that will greet visitors at the opening. One is a Stetson worn by Tom Mix, and early cowboy Wild West show star and early cowboy film star Tom Mix. And it's obviously one of the most iconic sort of brands of what we think of as what a Western hat should look like. White, good guy. But as Josh has pointed out to me, the John B. Stetson company that made the hat and Tom Mix were both from Pennsylvania. By contrast, the fedora on the other side has deeper roots in the American West. It was made by Paul Rowley, a Haida Tlingit weaver who adapted indigenous techniques going back thousands of years and long traditions of innovation to make this very hip cedar bark hat. Or at the other entrance to the gallery, on the other side, in a section called The View from Here, which I can't even take credit for, Josh, because you did that even before I arrived at the Autry, called The View from Here, is this hat from the Club Alabama in South Central LA, a famous jazz club in South Central LA, which again opens up, I think, the dimensions of the view from here for us. I should add, too, that Marina Nye, who's a UCLA graduate student, was able to actually decode all of these signatures on the hat, and sort of now we have a sort of a record of all the people who signed the hat. Or consider another exhibition that we have opening this summer about the experience of Native American children. This is in a much less whimsical and irreverent vein than the Imagined West Gallery, and that is the Sherman Indian Boarding School, as well as the one that's actually already opened at the Sherman Indian Boarding School in Riverside, away from home. And here again, the view from here featured by using the local boarding school, the Sherman Indian Boarding School, to shed light on a tragic local, regional, national, and multinational history of Indians in boarding schools. Now, you'll have to wait, though, till 2026 We have a lot of other of really exciting projects in the pipeline, but you'll have to wait, as I said, till 2026 for what I think is the signature project employing the view from here. Coinciding with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the Autry Museum will mark the occasion with an exhibition titled Human Events, The View from Los Angeles, 1776 to 2026. The reference in the main title is obvious, deriving from the first line of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration. But how does Los Angeles, and Hollis, I looked up the word afterwards, so from today, Hollis, how does Los Angeles on the other side of the continent from the anything but continental, Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, figure in this? Thank you. What does a Museum of the American West have to add to the commemorations, to the remembrances and reconsiderations that I'll just call it the 250th anniversary, will bring? Quite a lot, we argue, building on the fact that the Spanish Pueblo of Los Angeles was founded also during the American Revolution. More important, we will make the case that seeing the history of the United States and of the American West from Los Angeles broadens and deepens our understanding of both the American people, the American past, and the American pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness over the last 250 years. We hope that view helps us envision a more just and democratic American future, inspires a more just and democratic American future. Now, the goal of the view from here, I should emphasize, is not to create a museum of Los Angeles, even though I would argue we very much need a museum of Los Angeles. It is to develop instead a museum for Los Angeles, or more specifically, to create a museum of the American West in Los Angeles and for Los Angeles that brings together the stories of all peoples here, and that reckons with how our pasts and our fates are entwined with one another. That is a history that should matter more to more people. As a museum director, with a budget to balance, it also, I hope, may bring more people into the museum, which would certainly secure the Autry's assets. But it's not the bottom line, but our bottoms, about which I'm most concerned. Saving our asses is what animated my pursuit of an alternative history of peace and friendship, and it's what activates my vision for the Autry Museum. I hope you will all join me and help make that happen. Thank you.